Before the enslaved Africans came to the Western lands, or as Bob Marley puts it most delicately in Buffalo Soldier,
stolen from Africa, brought to America.
there are a few to none evidence before the 16th century of real literature in the Caribbean. However, Colombian American Indians did leave a few rock carvings and inscriptions known as petroglyphs, but their oral traditions didn't survive past the 16th century Spanish colonization. However, when Africans eventually did come to the islands, they did not only bring Creole, weed, reggae, Usain Bolt, Oriana, and of course, Nicki Minaj's sick-ass rhymes.
Sign, yeah. Metaphor heaven, so they approve Nicki like my credit score 7. Mac and cheese, 6 fried chicken nuggets, and I'm killing these, just might picking it up.
Please, can someone get this woman some lemon juice because she is sick? Anyway, they also came with some awesome literature that deserves its own respect too, you know. So let me take you back to a department of the Caribbean you probably never paid that much attention to. Yeah, be honest. As MeMsie Africa presents a special on the history of Caribbean literature. Caribbean literature refers to the literature of all Caribbean territories without consideration of language, whether it is English, Spanish, French, Hindustani, Portuguese, or even Dutch. But being the biased African children that we are, this documentary will be a little more linked on the literature of African descendants, because I just said it, we're totally biased like that. And please bear with us, Caribbean literature is much broader than you think. We cannot possibly cover every piece of art or author out there in this small time frame. Some books will be left out, although we tried our best to include every work of literature and events that we think are the most significant and important to shaping Caribbean culture to what it is today. Besides, MeMsie is just starting out, so we will probably discuss those books in future videos anyway. So, these written languages in the Caribbean, like back in the African continent itself, were inherited from colonial empires such as Spain, Britain, France, and etc. that captured these slaves from the African continent from the 17th century onwards. And the community of these authors includes writers from countries like Trinidad, Tobago, St. Lucia, Guyana, Martinique, Barbados, and of course, Jamaica, among others, to make what we call now the Caribbean. After slavery, for these freed slaves, it was anything but a straightforward battle against racism and the struggle for identity, respect, independence, and even basic everyday human rights. Because truth be told, the battle was just beginning. Most islands were still under colonial rule. After centuries of being demeaned and dehumanized by the brutality that went on those plantations, mentally speaking, there was still a lot of reparations that were needed for these newly freed slaves. Although it's kind of a crazy irony that the only people who got financial reparations for slavery, even up to now, are the European slave masters and not the actual slaves themselves. Just saying. Considering most of them were also mentally and physically uprooted from their native African cultures, most of the Black Caribbeans, being illiterate as well as an educated slave, was considered to be a dangerous slave. It meant culture-wise, they were basically starting from scratch. Between the times they were captured from the 18th century to the early 20th century, for the past centuries, much of the literature of these stolen Africans was an imitation of the colonizers' literature. There were no literary works published by native West Indians, and few literary works on the Caribbeans that were published only consisted mainly of Victorian women's travelogues such as Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre and slave narratives like those of Olaudah Equiano. But after 1913, things began to really change, as although still colonized and really poor, Africans familiarized, settled, and grew in consciousness of where they came from in their new island homes. That's when we came along with those dreads, and not to mention those awesome Creole accents.
We want the world to know that we don't have no place for racial superiority or racial inferiority. By the voice of the emperor, what we look at is universal brotherhood and sisterhood in Christ, irregardless of your race.
Yeah, man. I love the Caribbeans. But still, the former slaves needed empowerment, and empowerment that significantly came in the form of the inspirational, enigmatic Jamaican son of the soil, Marcus Garvey. In 1914, the enigmatic Jamaican son of the soil, Marcus Garvey, formed the Universal Negro Improvement Association and became such an enormous revolutionary movement that it had 2 million members by summer 1919 in the United States alone. In 1918, Marcus Garvey went on further to create the Negro World newspaper, first published in this year, which wrote stories that revolved around the society of people of African ancestry. The charismatic Marcus Garvey, idolized by most Jamaicans today and held by Rastafarians as the reincarnation of John the Baptist himself, made great strides in promoting his ideas of black empowerment, solidarity, pride, self-love, and the search of the lost African identity and dignity amongst all people of African descent, and even a physical return to the African continent, since we were indeed
Driven from the mainland to the heart of the Caribbean.
These beliefs will later be known by most scholars and Africans as Garveyism. Garveyism would also go on to be one of the greatest influences of most African ideologies in future politics, art, culture, society, literature, and even music. Garveyism would also set foundational influences in historical black liberation movements such as the Harlem Renaissance, Pan-Africanism, the Negritude, the liberation struggles back in Africa, to even the civil rights movement in USA. So in the 1920s, as black education rose, the first literary breakthroughs came in the French and Spanish islands with Aimé Césaire from Martinique, Jacques Romer of Haiti, Nicolas Guillen of Cuba, and Leo Damas of French Guiana were the first to develop a distinct literary style and identity. This style wasn't based on European ideas like in the past, but the authentic relationships exclusive to the black communities of the Caribbean. Founding authors like these served a priceless role of creating, shaping, and promoting the new Caribbean cultures, as well as spreading the word on the struggles of the former slave had in a European colonized community, such as mental colonization, foreign domination, identity crisis, alienation, self-hatred, racism, discrimination, illiteracy, and of course, poverty. I mean real earth-shattering poverty right here. Yeah, there were not too many good things to talk about the Caribbeans at that time, to be honest. Jean Price Mars, a Haitian ethnologist, defended the Haitian misunderstood voodoo religion, would also later champion the Negritude movement and began further restoring some of his people's dignity and integrity of their own traditional folklore with his piece Ains Parlons Creole, which is French for So Spoke the Uncle, in 1928. In 1933, celebrated writer Jamaican Claude McKay, during the Harlem Renaissance, famously wrote alongside other legendary poets like Langston Hughes and James Weldon Johnson. His poetry discussed and protested against the continued plight of black people and the politics that kept them oppressed, which kind of echoed the ideas of French Martinician poet Aimé Césaire, poetic piece Cahiers d'un retour au pays natal, or Notebook of a Return to My Native Land, in 1939, that explored the cultural identity and set the platform for a greater historical movement that was to come in the future, the Negritude, or as we say, please excuse my French, la Negritude. In the 1940s, three major literary breakthrough magazines were founded. These were Beam in Barbados, Focus in Jamaica, and Kijk Overal in British Guiana. An example of the contributions of many great Caribbean authors, magazines like these greatly helped shape West Indian literature post-World War II. Also in 1943, the BBC radio program Caribbean Voices established a major platform for Caribbean writers in England to be heard. Jamaican Una Mason, who was this legendary black feminist writer, poet, playwright, activist, and advocate for Jamaican literature, was actually the first black woman to work at BBC. Caribbean Voices gave the opportunity for a first generation of future-great authors and poets such as Kamal Brathwaite, Samuel Selvon, Derek Walcott, John Figueroa, Edgar Mittelhauser, Michael Anthony, V.S. Naipaul, Andrew Sauki, and others. It greatly spread the word and respect for all authors in general, both in the UK and back home in the Caribbean. After the end of World War II, in 1945, the British West Indies spread that consciousness for liberty. The French writers were still on a roll though. In 1948, by the empowering aesthetic poetic movement La Negritude, headed by its Caribbean founding fathers such as Aimé Césaire and Léon Damas, joined hands with West Africans like Senegalese Leopold Sédar Senghor to celebrate the aesthetic nostalgic beauty of Africa. Most of the poems employed surrealist techniques and incredible imagery that showed the essence and the meaning of true African beauty, which was not tempered by racism or colonization, which inspired the creation of such black empowering movements like Black is Beautiful in the USA, Afro-Surrealism, Creolite, and #melanin popping. Okay, I'm not sure whether it's actually a movement, but come on, you can't deny the Negritude influences on those Instagram pictures. In 1948 saw the opening of the University of West Indies in Jamaica, while the very next year V.S. Reid published New Day, which was a celebration of oncoming future Jamaican independence, a groundbreaking book that was widely considered to be the first use of modified form of Creole Jamaican dialect and rhythm that would also be seen in future novels like Orlando Patterson's The Children of Sisyphus, the poetic work of Mervyn Morris, and greatly popularized by the musical art forms of reggae and dancehall.
No friend we no keep with a boy where you switch. Got full bad mind in farmer where you snitch. Friend we no keep, 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 friend we no keep. Dirty life we know it. No, Aki alone now we national dish. Friend we no keep.
In the 1950s, from around this period, Caribbean immigrants would go on to achieve international fame, came forth due to a significant growth of Caribbean consciousness, self-awareness, education, thinking, philosophy, and scholars. In 1952, one such an iconic scholar emerged in the form of the Martinique writer Frantz Fanon, who wrote the psychoanalytical classic known as Black Skin, White Masks. The book explored efficiently the identity crisis all black people who have faced racism struggle with, shedding light on caution towards the issues such as identity loss and loss of self-respect. It was critical in laying out many racial inferiority complexes before they could be addressed, things that may now seem obvious but were not that obvious back then. In 1953, Phyllis Alfred wrote The Orchid House. Alfred's novel had a great reception, but it was grossly overshadowed by George Lamming's In the Castle on My Skin, exhibiting Frantz Fanon's philosophies. Lamming's work, which gained widespread praise, attention, and critical acclaim, is a highly celebrated textured story of an educated, alienated kid growing up in Barbados, like Zimbabwean Ndambuza or even George Lamming himself, and many other Barbados people of that time. Well, this G grew up in a British colonized community that excellently laid out the struggles throughout the eyes of a child, in a place of severe lack of resources, control, or opportunity for the black people. It spread awareness on the mental horrors of colonization, thus helping push for independence. In 1954, in the next year, Roger May gave us Brother Man, which is one of the first novels to really represent, explain, and explore the new and rather misunderstood Jamaican religion of Rastafarianism. It is so culturally significant in Jamaica, many of them believe it was actually a prophetic foreshadowing of the rising strength of the movement that would reach its mainstream peak 20 years later, when it would give us Bob Marley and reggae music itself, man. In the 1960s was a decade where many African nations back home and abroad in the Caribbean finally gained their independence from Western colonization or domination. This united ideas of solidarity in the hearts of all African descendants, because most people from the continent themselves were in more or less the same battle, whether it was fighting for independence back in Africa or fighting for human rights in the USA, a struggle that helped conceive a famous movement heavily influenced by Garveyism too, dubbed Pan-Africanism. Later in 1961 became another landmark year as the now iconic Caribbean writer V.S. Naipaul, who had written another well-received but very funny novel before, because the pointlessness of life is really funny. But he topped it by publishing A House for Mr. Beeswax, which is perhaps the most discussed and widely read novel in British West Indian history, about a house that can literally symbolize pretty much anything and everything in this world, sparking endless arguments and debates about what Mr. Beeswax's shaky-ass house was supposed to mean. Seriously, this is the single most famous house in world literature. Ask any university scholar or professor you want. As for me, I believe Mr. Beeswax's house stands for Cardi B. Don't ask me how I came up with that conclusion. I just know. In terms of cross-African literature, Frantz Fanon also came with another great one, The Wretched of the Earth, a prophetic book that foreshadowed the events and problems that would transpire as soon as most Africans gained their independence. Though not focused on the Caribbean itself, what made this book mind-blowing was its accuracy in predicting our current political climate of dictatorship, looting, poverty, human rights abuses, and corruption we struggle with our own black governments today. All African nations are independent, but whether most of us are free now? Well, let's just say that's another story for another day. Anyway, in 1966, some female writers emerged who turned the scope towards feminist issues. Jean Brice from Dominica retold a much more fleshed-out notion of the sidelined Creole woman Antoinette in Wide Sargasso Sea, who was just a mad woman in the Arctic, in English writer Charlotte Bronte's classic novel Jane Eyre, or Eyre, I don't know. This novel, like Jane Eyre, was focused on the patriarchal society women had to deal with, but however, in addition, it also shed further light on the racism part. Because though white, the lead character Antoinette's biggest burden she faces in the novel is social rejection due to her non-British Creole heritage. In the 70s, Derek Walcott opened the new decade with a play called Dream on Monkey Mountain, which bemoaned the mental effects of 400 years of colonial rule by symbolically portraying it through Macaque, who hates his blackness as Fanon proposed in Black Skin, White Masks, but by the end of the play conquers this self-hatred by beheading the white goddess in his dreams. Such symbolism reflected the current climate of how Caribbeans were now loving their own culture in their actual society. But more importantly, in 1970, Mary Hodge, a woman, published Crick Crack Monkey. Although not as big as Wide Sargasso Sea, it's equally as important because it contains a fresh take when the victim of racism becomes the racists themselves.
Sometimes victims of oppression are so marginalized that they begin to sympathize with their oppressors. Yeah, bro, you're right.
Mele Hodge's publication in the 70s really opened doors for an emergence of the women's narrative in the Caribbean in the 80s. paving the way for future feminist works from brainy trailblazing female authors such as Anna Broadbar, Michelle Cliff, Z. Edgar, Mahadai Das, Velma Pollard, and Jamaica Kincaid, who wrote Lucy and Annie Jones, to more 21st contemporary ones such as Nicole Dennis Benn or Naomi Jackson. In 1980, with the Rastafarian movement now at its peak as influenced by Marcus Garvey and predicted by Roger Miles' brother man, Bob Marley released Redemption Song. If you were really paying attention to the issues discussed in this special, you would realize how significant this song is to Jamaican, even Caribbean literature as a whole based on its subject matter alone. Besides its great musical composition, what made this song legendary are the various insightful meanings it may have. As a song Bob Marley wrote at the near end of his life after he was diagnosed with terminal cancer, many believe it was him embracing this mortality. It could also be interpreted as his one last important message to all his black brothers and sisters by directly quoting Marcus Garvey himself.
Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. Now back to ourselves can free our mind. Have no fear for atomic energy, 'cause none of them can stop the time.
Or it could be just a reflection on how the once enslaved and colonized Caribbean citizens had come so far in redefining and redeeming their identity and culture, hence its title, Redemption Song. However you see it, yeah, it's one of the greatest musical records ever. You see how true legacy never dies? Jumping to the post-1990s, having come a really long way with now having a respectable history of writers, poets, playwrights, thinkers, scholars, philosophers, and artists in general. In 1992, Derek Walcott, who was born in St. Lucia, made history by becoming the first Caribbean author to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. A lot of his work was widely acclaimed, but most critics see his true legacy as the poetic epic masterpiece of the ocean, Omeros. With now great respect and recognition, as the century was now winding down, you could say his win was another symbolic event of how Caribbean literature itself had come so far. There are a lot more great stories that were written after this time, but that's another story for another day. So till that time we visit those stories, don't forget to subscribe, and thanks for watching MeMsie Africa. Yep.